In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, so
Okay, here we
we're
go.
recording, so you can start by telling us why you're not live.
I'm not live because I am going to be speaking to Scottish Parliament tomorrow. I'm going to Scotland tomorrow. And I'm hoping that I can convince them to think twice about legislating to allow assisted dying. And it's a really tricky issue because it's something that I was always in favor of. I'm a liberal type, and I think you should, you know, be free to end your life, particularly, well, you should be free to end your life if you're suffering. And I never thought anything of it in Canada when it was being discussed. There were safeguards in place, and it seemed like, yeah, just like the logical thing to do. And then over time, these stories started to trickle out. And I realized that we weren't allowing assisted dying because we had become more liberal, but because we were becoming more blasé about human life, but the value of human life. And I realized it was coming from a really dark place. And that's what I think. I think you can have assisted dying if you have a commitment to human life as being extraordinarily valuable. But if you have the opposite, which is what I think is happening, then it's a very dangerous thing. And this is what's going on in Canada. The trouble is that when people were legislating or lobbying for this legislation, and when they are lobbying for it in all these different countries, they will focus on the sorts of cases that nobody has a problem with. Like you're at the very end of your life and you're in a lot of pain, and people are like, yeah, of course. But the trouble is that it keeps.
All right, so we've got some technical difficulties at the beginning. My microphone simply wasn't plugged in. Now that would have been something that we caught when Ashley joined the stream. She would have told me, "Hey, I can't hear you," and I would have looked and I would have seen my microphone wasn't plugged in, but I didn't notice that. So I'm interrupting the broadcast to repeat what I said before, which is that well, two things. One, apparently the sound on the pre-recorded video is no good, so I'm going to try a different approach to showing it. We have a different approach, but also, hey, let me tell you what I was rattling on about silently before, which is that on Saturday we're going to be releasing a film on our YouTube channel from David Shields. It's the 29-minute core of his documentary, How We Got Here. We're publishing his book by the same title. We're encouraging everyone to watch at 9 a.m. Pacific. The sound will work. I've tested it out. There will be sound for this. It will be very exciting. It's also in color. So that's another reason to go and watch. If you show up at 9 a.m. Pacific, you'll be able to chat with Spencer Leonard, who's a historian, and he'll be leading a kind of auto critique of the film in the chat. He will also have a Zoom call afterwards for people who participate. The reason we're trying to throw together a watch party and get everyone to watch at 9 a.m. on Saturday is the more people who watch a video in the first hour, the more the algorithm thinks, oh, this is very popular. I should share it with more people. It pushes it forward. We get more views. We get more excited people who want to help me run the technical side of the operation. And, we slowly but surely conquer the world. So please do show up at 9 a.m. this Saturday. That's the 30th, March 30th. Watch the 29-minute video. It's very good. It's very interesting, professionally made. And, again, sound, color, all the works. And let's see if we can get this to work to show the pre-recorded video that I made with Ashley. Let's see where that would be here as a file on my computer rather than. Well, actually, people were saying that the sound was corrected. Let me see if I can run it again that way, and what you guys think of it now. Let me know in the chat if it is working or not. So here we go. All right, so
Okay, here we
we're
go.
recording. So you can start by telling us why you're not live.
I'm not live because I am going to be speaking to Scottish Parliament tomorrow. I'm going to Scotland tomorrow. And I'm hoping that I can convince them to think twice about legislating to allow assisted dying. And it's a really tricky issue because it's something that I was always in favor of. I'm a liberal type, and I think you should, you know, be free to end your life, particularly, well, you should be free to end your life if you're suffering. And I never thought anything of it in Canada when it was being discussed. There were safeguards in place, and it seemed like, yeah, just like the logical thing to do. And then over time, these stories started to trickle out. And I realized that we weren't allowing assisted dying because we had become more liberal, but because we were becoming more blasé about human life, but the value of human life. And I realized it was coming from a really dark place. And that's what I think. I think you can have assisted dying if you have a commitment to human life as being extraordinarily valuable. But if you have the opposite, which is what I think is happening, then it's a very dangerous thing. And this is what's going on in Canada. The trouble is that when people were legislating or lobbying for this legislation, and when they are lobbying for it in all these different countries, they will focus on the sorts of cases that nobody has a problem with. Like you're at the very end of your life and you're in a lot of pain. And people are like, yeah, of course. But the trouble is that it keeps expanding. And there's nothing that you can do to stop it from expanding because it falls on discrimination ground. So what you're saying is like you're discriminating against this particular group by not allowing them to have assisted dying. So that's how it winds up being opened up. So it's like, oh, we should open it up for this group and we should open up for this group. And now in Canada, they're arguing to open it up to people with mental illness and children, mature minors, using the concept of guilt competence, this idea that you should be able to make these kinds of, the sort of thing that allowed abortion is really important. It allowed abortion decisions to be made or birth control decisions to be made for minors. Because the argument was, well, like you can understand that having a child is going to cause you a lot of trouble. At least at that age, that is an understanding that you can have. And now that's kind of being used to say, well, like, what about mature minors? These people can also make this kind of decision. And as I was writing a piece for Compact um, about a month ago, I was doing a literature review, as I usually do before I go to write a piece. I sort of look at what the recent kind of papers have been written. And it was just a deluge of papers about how allowing people who are in poverty to keep living or forcing them to keep living is doing harm. And since we're not going to end poverty anytime soon or end social problems anytime soon, it is harmful, these papers were arguing, to not allow assisted dying for people in poverty, to not allow assisted dying for people in situations of injustice. So this is what happened. Um, so it's highly concerning that this is like the when I wrote at the end of that compact piece with this is a policy that emerges in the politics of the void, where we've not been able to bridge the chasm between what is and what ought to be. And we live, I talk about this a lot, in my work. We live in this sort of abyss in the void, in that world, in a world where we've never been able to cross over into a future that we know is possible, but haven't been able to create. We live in this kind of interregnum. And we've begun to throw people down into that abyss. Well, we're never going to solve these problems. Why not just allow people who are suffering? Not even allow people, but how could you deny people who are suffering the right to die? This is where we are. And I think that is not a good place to be.
Yeah, it seems to me that quite a lot of the problems that we're facing on the left, as would be socialists, come down to um, this difficulty with creating a political project in the context of the contradictions of the present, um, without falling into the contradiction yourself and taking up one side or the other in a way that only deepens the contradiction, makes it more difficult to overcome. And uh, this is really why sublation is called sublation. It's to try to develop a political project that won't fall into that trap. So I hope you have luck tomorrow. But today we're going to be talking about this appearance that Slavoj Zizek made on Pier Morgan. It made the rounds on Twitter. It went a bit viral. People were outraged by um, what Slavoj Zizek said. There are a few clips I've taken here from the interview, but the one I want to start with is the one that I think made the rounds and that people were most upset with, and we'll discuss it after. So here's the clip of Slavoj Zizek on Piers Morgan.
Let me talk to you first about Ukraine, Russia. I had a guy called John Mearsheimer on recently, who was arguing to me that Russia was provoked into this war, they shouldn't be blamed for it, and so on. I have a very different view. What is your view about where we are with this war?
This conversation is turning very bad because, again, there is no opposition. I agree with you. But what may be a surprise for you is that I agree with you as a lefty. That is to say, don't people listen, my God, to what Russia their official media, Putin and so on, what they are saying. Some of my crazy leftist friends even claim, but nonetheless, Russia is anti-NATO, so it must be good. Are they crazy? Look at whom Russia is supporting in Western Europe. Only the radical right-wingers,
Yeah.
Le Pen's Alternative for Germany in Germany, and so on. Second thing, you know what Putin said on the day of the invasion, 21st and then 23rd of February, a year ago, or 2 years ago even. He said something terrifying. He said the true name of Russia should be Russia of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So he wants to take from Ukrainians something that only, paradoxically, I'm very critical of Lenin, the early Bolshevik gave them. So this is clear for Putin. He is in no way a lefty, my God. No, he's a dark, conservative, religious fanatic. That's why to provoke people, as you know, I think I said give even nuclear arms to Ukraine. As
Yeah,
a
well, on that point,
I'm saying,
on that point,
we have to
Slavoj,
do everything.
Yeah, I think it was a terrible mistake for Ukraine to be persuaded to give up their nuclear capability, because it seemed to me that was just a green light to Putin to then invade them.
Absolutely. I mean, okay, it's true that at that point, am I correct or not? I'm not sure. It wasn't yet Putin, it was Yeltsin.
Right.
But they should have taken this precaution.
Yeah.
Because it's clear, here I disagree with Mersheimer, it's clear that it's not just Ukraine. It's clear that it began with Georgia, Georgia, Crimea, Moldova, and so on. No, Russia is, they openly say it's in an imperial expansionist state. And I think the longer we tolerate it, the more horrible will be the final confrontation.
Yes.
That's why, incidentally, I read as far as I can their media. You know, I hope we agree also here. One of the most stupid, politically correct pacifist saying is an enemy is somebody whose word you did not listen. No, sorry, I read Hitler, Mein Kampf, and after reading that, he was even more my enemy. So that's why I think we should read what horrors they are saying, Russian media. They have a full return to religious fundamentalism. They portray the war in Ukraine as the war of Christian civilization against demoniac satanism and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, they are no less than Arabs. They are today in the worst sense, fanatical religious fundamentalists.
Yeah.
They have to be stopped unconditionally. The West has to stop this ambiguous game of trying to support Ukraine, but not too much, so that we will not annoy Russia too much, and so that we will not hurt our standard of living too much. No, we are in an emergency state, we, Europe.
So what did you think of that, Ashley?
So one of the things that struck me when I was listening to this interview was a lot of the times when a conflict breaks out, we have a tendency to look for the good guys. Who are the good guys? Whose side should we be on? And obviously, you know, you're on the side of the people that get caught up in all of this, and you hope that innocent people don't get killed, that sort of thing. But in terms of like the major players, sometimes we have to understand there are no good guys, you know, and that's something that I think we tried to get across around October 7th. That just because Israel had done horrible things, it doesn't mean that what Hamas had done was righteous and good. And a lot of people were pretty pissed off at us for saying that. But I think that's often the case, particularly when it comes to capitalist conflict and imperial expansion. Like, obviously, you can be against that, particularly, obviously, you must be against that when it comes to Israel. But that doesn't mean that just anyone who comes up is therefore your friend.
Right. Well, what I was struck by, I mean, the first thing to object to and what Zizek said was that he thinks that the United States should continue to arm and fully support Ukraine because Russia is a particularly menacing evil in the world. It represents a kind of Christian fundamentalism, and it is a liberal state, and that it has imperialist designs on Europe, and it must be stopped. Um, so these are fairly standard talking points that you would hear from the neoconservative wing, both in the Democratic and Republican Party. You would hear it from the Tories in the UK and probably from Keir Starmer's Labour Party as well. But the the difficulty, we're gonna just hit this same point, and this is called both sidism, I think. That's what we'll get accused of. Um, but both sidism is good, I'm gonna claim. Because in some ways, everything except for the prescription, which is to fund the war to the hilt and to try to stop Russia now rather than have to deal with a further invasion later. All of that, I think, we could put aside as wrong-headed. But there is truth to the idea that the Russian state is, at least uses fundamentalist Christianity, yes, Orthodox Christianity, to buttress its ideological dominance of the nation. That it does cast the war as a clash of civilizations, the decadent West against the Christian East, I guess, in this case, or the religious East, or the Great Russian Empire. But the key, I think, to understanding the reality of the situation is to ask to what degree is political freedom existing in any of the nations that are at war? To what degree do the people in these nations have some control and say, and in over their governments, over the states? And in Ukraine, um, the level of freedom is quite restricted. The government has been known to be corrupt and run by oligarchs since the beginning, really, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and has never quite overcome that. The left, we just did an interview with Volodymyr Ashenko, who was a writer for Verso and a Ukrainian, part of the New Left in Ukraine, and who has fled Ukraine. And the interview was all about the ways in which a socialist left just failed to fully emerge in the post-Soviet context, and the difficulties that there were, the way in which the leftists themselves were split against each other and had different class interests and represented different parts of the country, and rural and urban and so forth. And so Ukraine, where the Communist Party is illegal, socialist parties are illegal, there is no freedom of the press, they're locking up dissidents against the war. Those journalists are dying in prison. Certainly is not on the side of liberalism in any meaningful way. And of course, Russia is similarly very bad when it comes to political freedom. The people there do not have any ability really to organize legally for an opposition to the current regime, and their constitutionally protected free speech laws are actually, the Article 29 in the Russian Constitution is explicitly says it's, guaranteeing there will be no censorship, except what it really does is institutionalize and enshrine forms of censorship that says, propaganda or campaigning to incite social, racial, national, or religious hatred and strife is impermissible. The propaganda of social, racial, national, religious, or language superiority is forbidden. And it says everyone shall have the right to seek, get, transfer, produce, and disseminate information by any lawful means. The list of information constituting the state secret shall be established by federal law. The freedom of the media shall be guaranteed. It says censorship, the freedom of the mass media shall be guaranteed. Censorship shall be prohibited. So this is basically defining how the Russian state and on what grounds the Russian state can pass laws to limit speech in Russia. Whereas in the United States, First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law inhibiting or limiting the freedom of speech. Period. The end. That's it. There's none of these loopholes. And yet, the United States, as the superpower behind Ukraine, is currently in the midst of developing workarounds for free speech in the United States, which means not just like, oh, you can't say the N word on Twitter anymore or something like that, but rather it means that the political organizing against the current ruling class, whether Republican or Democrat, will be severely constrained and shut down either by the new version of the Restrict Act or by this network of NGOs, which appear to be about to get the green light to proceed to censor the United States. So, and I know I go on and on about censorship, but the point here is that since no oppositional political project can emerge under these conditions in Russia or Ukraine, for socialists to believe that backing one side or the other advances the cause of socialism, I think is misguided. Now, obviously, there are a lot, there are other arguments like we want to support struggles for national independence and liberation and so forth, which would put us on the side of Ukraine on those grounds. But on the other hand, there's the anti-imperialist left, which says, "Oh no, it's Russia," despite its character standing up to the global hegemon, the United States, therefore must be supported in order to defeat that global hegemon. I just feel as though none of those positions, pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, make a lot of sense, and that, and at the very least, when we hear from someone like Slavoj Zizek saying that he supports Ukraine, the last thing we should do is try to cancel him or
Of course.
push him out of the debate, but take on what he says and see to what degree what he's saying makes sense. I don't think the split between the West and the East in terms of the cultural attitudes or the amount, even the level of freedom, although we have more freedom in the West than exists in Russia or Ukraine, those things are under threat. So I don't think that dichotomy really holds. But I definitely think that the last thing we need to do is pick out the fact that he mentioned Arabs as being fundamentalist,
I was
as some
about
sort
to
of,
say
yeah,
that, yeah.
yeah. Go
So,
ahead.
what I find very interesting is the degree to which conflicts now, not just, full scale military conflict, but our cultural conflict, so many conflicts are framed as a fight between the West, Western values, civilizational values, and some kind of threat. And people kind of eat that up and buy that. So it's like, yeah, because the West is shit, so let's oppose it, kind of thing. So I've seen like Israel kind of framed that way, obviously. Like, oh,
Mhm.
gosh, I've been in very deep, drunken debates about this, but where it's like, well, Israel has to win. They have to win because it's a civilizational um, conflict. You know, crazy. Um,
Mhm.
but by the same token, it's like this sort of anti-imperialism has taken this kind of anti-Western knee-jerk kind of reaction that I don't think is thought through particularly well, where it's like, yes, this is a civilizational conflict, but it's between, the forces of good against the terrible expansionism of quote unquote your so-called civilization. And I don't think those framings are correct. But what's interesting too is that for all of the discussion, for all of the attempt to frame conflict in terms of civilization or Western values, or which becomes sort of a new kind of good versus evil, is the degree to which nobody actually believed in the civilizational values of liberal enlightenment. That
Mhm.
it's supposed to, that's what we're defending, right? If when we talk about that, oh, against barbarism, against this, against that, against Arabs. But who actually believes in any of those values? As you were saying, um, the governments of all of these supposedly liberal Western civilizations are doing everything that they can to reposition civilization as kindness and caring. And if you're on the side of kindness and caring, then actually you should want us to delete our liberal values, which are insufficiently caring and protective of the weak in our society. And then this becomes a a thin veneer for the destruction of freedoms. So, well, why are we supposed to accept limitations on freedom of speech? Oh, certainly not to protect those in power. No, no, no. Those in power simply want to protect the weak in society. They simply want to protect them from hurt and from harm. And of course, that then becomes a way for that's the banner. That's what people lobby on. Because what are you going to say? Like, no, we should hurt the weak in society. No, people, you know, you should be able to say the N word whenever you want. That's like the where we're invited to debate about things, and only an asshole would be like, well, yeah, you should be able to say that. A good person would be like, well, why do you need to say that? But of course, in a free society, you don't need to say why you need to say anything. That's the point. That's why you have that kind of freedom. Um, but this has become our grounds of conflict. We're supposed to fight over these things, either before or against them, even though there's nothing there anymore. There's nothing. Nobody believes in Western values. What the fuck does that mean? Oh, excuse my French. Sorry. What do these things? They've been hollowed out of meaning, and so it just becomes, I don't know, a kind of stand-in for good versus evil, where like the West is good or what is anti-West is good. Um, and it's a very shallow way of understanding a global conflict or even our culture wars.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. Let's try it again. So let's talk about what's the evil that everyone's afraid of. It's often called fascism. That's how it was discussed on the Piers Morgan show. And I'll run the clip where they're talking about the great evil that's facing all of society. Here it is.
What for me, the problem with cancel culture, it's evident to me as a philosopher. They preach inclusion and diversity. But what are they doing? They are precisely excluding everyone who is diverse, who doesn't follow their line.
Yes,
And
exactly.
the situation is extremely annoying. Yeah, because you even don't know the rules in advance. All of a sudden, for something, you can be cancelled. The rules are not clear. So you know what this cancel culture reminds me of? This eternal joke, everybody knows it. A researcher comes to a lone tribe and asks them, do you still have cannibals there? The answer they get is, no, we just ate the last cannibal last week. That's what cancel culture is doing.
Yes, it is.
No, we have no male chauvinism, exclusionism, whatever here, because we just excluded the last one. That's the reality. That's the tragedy of cancel culture.
Yes.
I agree in principle with their goals, some of, not but generally. But the way they want to enforce their goals, the very way they do what they are doing undermines what they are doing. It's a tragedy. And as such, they are giving arguments, energy to the new populist right. They fit together. For me, the new populist right and this woke, politically correct, cancel culture left are simply two sides of the same coin.
I completely agree. In fact, I would go further and say that they're basically both forms of fascism. And the irony about the woke left is that if you ask them what's the thing you hate most in the world, they would probably say fascism. And yet the way they behave in canceling people for having opinions, in trying to destroy their lives, in canceling history and canceling everything in life that people enjoy, is that they're behaving exactly like fascists would behave.
Here I would, no, I completely disagree with you.
Finally,
Freudian slip.
finally.
Let's go back. I completely, no. I agree with you. I would just be careful with the term fascism, because if we define fascism in a broader sense, not anti-Semitism, kill all the enemy, but the basic idea of fascism is, for me, we want modern technology, modernization, and so on, but we don't want the disruptive effects of freedom, liberalism. We want to control it by some central national imposed ideology and third party. Then you know how far I'm here ready to go. Take countries like Russia, like India, like Turkey, and maybe China itself. In some sense, this broad sense, not exactly Nazism, they are all moving in this direction.
All right. So, what's interesting about that clip is that the fascism that they're discussing, it begins with the West, begins with cancel culture, begins with the, the regime of caring and health and protection, this feminized bureaucratic state, but then it slips into basically defining Trump and any populist movement as fascist as well. And I guess I wonder to what degree is it fair to categorize what we're facing actually as fascism? When if we look at Russia and Ukraine, can we say that they're both fascist? Or is Hamas and Israel, are they both fascist political entities?
So this is the tricky thing, right? When you take a list approach or a definitional approach to fascism, then anything that shares those characteristics becomes fascist. And of course,
Mhm.
this becomes really silly. So it's like fascists were vegetarians often. So anybody who's vegetarian is fascist. Then
I happen to think that that's right. I mean, I think that in fact, if you're a vegetarian, you're clearly a fascist. But anyway, go on.
or like that they were anti-smoking. So then anti-smoking laws are fascist. This kind of thing. Whereas if you take a kind of relational approach to fascism, then you understand it. You understand it in its historical specificity. And this is why I bang on and on about Ishai Lanta's work. And I think more people should read it, because I think he takes that relational approach, which is that fascism was a response to the failures of liberalism. And of course, Landa's not the only one to say that. There's some very good literature from the 60s and 70s that talks about the roots of fascism and frustrated liberalism. And you can see this in a lot of the proto-fascists, that they were frustrated liberals. My favorite proto-fascist being Vilfredo Pareto, where he begins as a liberal and he gets frustrated with the fact that people just don't behave correctly. And instead of kind of rethinking his models and his understanding of how capitalism should work, how free markets should work, whether or not they not should work in the sense of like dictating, but saying like, look, this is how the system functions. And then he sort of looks out into the world and he sees that it's not functioning and he blames the people. So instead of questioning his model, he, throws humanity out the window because they don't live up to the model. And so he becomes more and more frustrated with freedoms. And he says the problem with governments is that they were not willing to use force, that they were too scared to use force to reach the end that they needed to reach, and that this led the world to hell. This led to the sort of erosion of support for markets and the policies that they really should undertake. They become too weak, and they fall to the socialists who are completely misguided. So there's a core of kind of frustrated liberalism, and in addition, a need to suppress the results of liberalism. So Landa talks about the split between economic liberalism and political liberalism. That if you what happens with a lot of liberals is that they have a commitment to economic liberalism, and in order to see economic liberalism through to its conclusions, you have to throw political liberalism out the window. Because if you have people having freedom, they will want to have a say over the economy. They will want to have a say over their material existence. They won't want to leave that up to chance or technocratic intervention or, you know, the free market or whatever. They will want to subject that also to political contestation. That's what socialism was, or communism, or that's what socialism and communism are aiming toward. This sort of democratization of the economy. And that's a horror show. That's a horror story for the economic liberals. And so if you understand fascism as that kind of relationship between a contradiction that arises between economic liberalism and political liberalism, then it makes a lot more sense why they start to um, exert so much control. And of course, particularly German fascism or Nazism arose from this horror at socialists and communists, I should say communists, Marxists, that were attempting a revolution. And they blamed, Hitler particularly, blamed the loss of the First World War on the communists and on the Jews. That there was a mixture between a kind of communist conspiracy and a Jewish conspiracy. And people think like, it's interesting that we have the legacy of fascism in our mind is like people just became so supremacist, so certain of their superiority that they just killed everybody else. If you actually look at Hitler's speeches, he often finished with this ultimatum or this us or them kind of thing. If we don't do this, they will do it to us. They said the Jews will exterminate us. They said the Jews will exterminate us. They have a plan for world domination. And that plan was clear in the failed German Revolution, and um, in the Soviet Union, and in the Russian Revolution. That this was and they had a particular. They were the worst to Soviet Jews, right? They saved their particular vitriol for Soviet Jews. If you were a Jewish Soviet prisoner of war, you were fucked. Um, and so we lose a lot when we take a list approach. And I know I do this sometimes too, because sometimes it can be kind of illuminating in sort of scaring us off, taking particular positions. If we recognize that these were positions that the Nazis held. And I do this sometimes for like romantic anti-capitalism. And I warn people off of it by pointing out that Nazis were avowed socialists. And they hated Marxist socialism, but they believed in like caring for each other, community over the individual, that there had been too much individualism. Obviously, they meant caring for each other of the both. um, but they avowed a certain kind of socialism that itself had a history. And I know I spent years sort of saying like, oh, Nazis ate the language of socialism in an attempt to dupe the workers. This is partially true. Like Hitler would talk out of both sides of his mouth. He would say one thing to the workers trying to win them over and then say another thing to the capitalists. There was, to the extent that there's like a coherent, like Nazi ideology, it's difficult to kind of pin down. But they tried to flesh out a kind of socialism that had its base in, romanticism, anti-enlightenment, and then the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. Whereas Marxism was meant to realize the impossible promises of the Enlightenment within capitalism. So moving beyond capitalism to realize the promises of the Enlightenment. And this goes back to Marx's roots in the young Hegelians. The young Hegelians, they loved the liberalism, they loved the Enlightenment, they called themselves encyclopedists. They were very pro Enlightenment, and the Nazis were very anti-Enlightenment. They were, famously, was it Himmler said 1789 is abolished. The French Revolution is abolished. This was a mistake. So there's certain aspects of that kind of definitional approach that can be illuminating. But I think fundamentally you have to understand it as a relational thing, something that arises at a particular moment to exert control over that political force that attempts to lay its hands on the economy and will attempt another revolution to reach its ends. And, the famous line from Walter Benjamin, every fascism is an index of a failed revolution, is really illuminating of that. So when we lose that, we just kind of say we see fascism everywhere because we see the kind of superficial relationship. And that relational approach can also be illuminating because you can kind of ask yourself, it's not literally fascism. So, because the relational approach teaches you about historical specificity, that it comes up at a particular time in response to particular things that are happening that were happening in those societies. Fascism arose in that very particular context. But at the same time, if you understand it as a relational thing, you can see, well, we've never actually sorted out that contradiction. We've never sorted out that contradiction. And our societies are still trying to work through it, still trying to suppress the human hand on history, still trying to limit freedom everywhere. And that doesn't make it fascist, but it means that we've never sorted out the problems that led to fascism.
One of the consequences, I think, of not having an active, present, visible socialist movement anywhere is that the claims of fascists that, for instance, there's a communist conspiracy to destroy Western values, Western society, and by that they will, at least in one breath, point to the very things that I want to defend, like free speech and free inquiry, um, and the power of the people to create alternative political projects, and also limits on industry and free association in the economic realm. They'll point to all those things, point out how the state is attacking those kinds of freedoms, claim that there's a communist conspiracy, and because there is no socialist or Marxist movement amongst working people to speak of, the progressive capitalists will step forward and say, yes, we are communists. We do want to abolish the family. Yes, we do not trust you to run your own lives. Yes, you do need to be protected from yourselves and turn to the people in authority to before you make a move. And then also, yes, we do need to arm Ukraine to the hilt, and yes, we do need to send your brothers and sisters off to fight in wars. And yes, you do need to stay in your homes and be locked down. And yes, you do need to stop thinking for yourself, and so on and so forth. So that looks like any move to critique society as it is actually an existential threat to society as it is, and people who would like some kind of security turn against critique itself, and certainly against the idea of communism or socialism or Marxism, or at least some numbers do. And you have what was the guy Lindsay? What's his name? The one of the new
James
Sokol,
Lindsay.
James Lindsay. Yeah, James Lindsay is like, he rails and rails against the Marxists and the communists and these illiberal, antisocial, narcissistic sociopaths that are dominating the universities. And in some ways, he's not wrong. If there are many so-called communists who are actually progressive capitalists who, um, in a one-sided way, they try to create policies to help people that are also uh, very oppressive. And they believe in what they say, like we should abolish the family, for reasons that are not entirely untrue, even, but that outside of the context of an overall project for social emancipation, that is the emancipation of civil society, we, they will only turn into kind of a Brave New World dystopian project. And then the flip side of it is just religious tyranny, actually, and usually enshrined into law. And so you know, you're faced with a kind of fascism that is also could be called communism just as easily, a good portion of the time. But there's uh, no real clarity about the forces at work in society, and certainly no promise for a politics that can get beyond them. And I do worry when I hear someone like Donald Trump. I kind of make light of it, like, ha ha ha. He's going to throw all the Marxists out of the country. Okay, well, I hope that I get it on video so I can put it on YouTube and get clicks when I get deported. Um, but yeah, it is there's something threatening about James Lindsay when he talks that way. It does echo something. It's not crazy to think these people are the very thing that they're trying to critique, but the reverse is also true. So
What I find very interesting, and I think at one point I had an answer for this, and perhaps I'll have to write about it so that I'll never forget it. But I started to notice that a lot of the things that Marx talked about were that would happen with the transition of capitalism, socialism, are happening now, but in a kind of nightmare world. So you have like the withering away of the state. The state's more and more useless. Um, but the idea is the withering away of the state was like the administration. We would just have like the administration of things, right? That's all the state would do. But now the state is the administration of people only. It's like it becomes this more and more of our. I know that's quite an overstatement, obviously, but this is like a tendency that you can
mm,
see where it's what was good about a state was that it could mobilize enormous amounts of resources for infrastructure um, that an individual couldn't do because he wouldn't make back your money. It would just take such a long time that there would be absolutely no point. The requirement for investment in enormous infrastructure, like, I don't know, building huge bridges and tunnels and connecting. There used to be a dream of connecting New York and Paris with an underground tunnel, with
mm,
high speed rail. And the only a state could do that. Only a state historically could mobilize such enormous resources. But a state doesn't do that anymore. Or like the NHS increasingly moves away. It's been the trajectory for the last several decades, has been this move toward neoliberal kind of forms of um, governmentality of the body, governing the body, of um, giving you information, you know, and and that was sort of the informational approach was kind of reached its sort of heyday in the 90s, and then it became a little more coercive, as people supposedly didn't accept or adopt the information, at least not sufficiently. And you get this idea that the purpose of the National Health Service is not to fix your body when it breaks down, but to maintain health. And it's not even like you get this idea. It's often explicitly said that,
mm,
people will complain, oh, we have a national health service, but actually it's a national illness service because it's actually just fixing you. We should have a health service that keeps you healthy. But then it becomes about behavior. It becomes about behavior management. What do you need to do to keep yourself healthy so that you will not use the NHS? Right.
mhm,
And it's a similar thing in Canada, where they're moving away from high tech cancer care, understandably. Well, they're not moving away; they still begrudgingly offer it. But in terms of policy, they're like, "Oh yeah, like let's just encourage people to eat healthy, obviously policymakers are open to that because high-tech cancer care is extremely expensive. And as populations get older, they will spend more on it. And so if the answer to that is like encouraging people to eat more broccoli, obviously they're going to be on this on side. But of course, populations get older regardless of how much broccoli they eat. Eventually you're going to die of something. Um, but there's this kind of frustration with people's rising expectations. And I could tell a kind of whole story about that. I give a whole lecture on this, but it's interesting because rising expectations, low expectations used to be seen as a barrier that when you were like in a developmental phase, you needed to teach people to have raised expectations about their health because when they had raised expectations about their health, they tended to have raised expectations about their lives, and supposedly this would foster entrepreneurship. So when they went into, when international development agencies went into developing countries, they would often express frustration at the fact that people tended to have a fatalistic outlook. They tended to see illness as fate, as something God given, as maybe even punishment, this sort of thing. And so they would try to raise people's expectations around health. But now it's like raised expectations are a dangerous thing, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world. Because when those expectations are frustrated, then you have a population that knows their lives can be better. We're promised lives that were going to be better,
Mhm.
you know, follow us, do our thing, take our loans, and your lives are going to be better. And they didn't get any better. Well, now you got people leaving, and you got people with dark skin going to Europe. Well, that's the wrong kind of migration. We don't want that. And so now there's this whole thing to kind of like dampen down people's expectations. And so in our sort of health agencies, we are trying to kind of dampen people's expectations down to try and encourage them to like accept, why in our culture do we have this prejudice against death? Death is a normal part of life. Well, to be sure it is, but the progressive impulse has always been to extend life, to extend its value, its the desire to live it, and to make it as good as possible for as long as possible.
Mhm.
That goes all the way back to the 18th century when people began to see progress and they imagined that, oh my God, we're not even going to die anymore. Or that, as Condorcet put it, the human lifespan would know of no upper limit. That was like the 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 dream of the progressives. Now we're
Mhm.
kind of leaving that behind. So I find it very interesting that these ideas of you can have this kind of something can superficially look socialist, like it's the withering away of the state, that can actually be a horrific disintegration of the state in capitalism. Another one is
Well, we got one more clip to go, and we're 51 minutes in, so we should run our next clip before we continue
well,
on. But let me finish.
let me just
I'll let you finish
finish
the
the
thought.
point. Oh, yeah, just that the other one was, like, abolish the family. So, like, being anti-family has this kind of superficial socialist ring, and people go, "Oh, there you go, as a socialist, I'm against the family." But, of course, the suspicion toward the family is also a key aspect of neoliberal governance. This idea that, you can't allow parents who are blithering idiots to raise their children. Did I use that word correctly? Blithering idiots?
Yeah,
Blathering
I think
idiots?
so. Yeah, blithering idiot. Don't be a
You
blithering
can't.
idiot. Use that
Yeah,
correctly.
right. I wanted to make sure I said that correctly because that would be bad, but I probably did say it wrong.
Blithering
Sorry.
idiot. Let's see. A blithering idiot's according to that's a beer company. The Cambridge Dictionary says an extremely stupid person would be a blithering idiot. So,
Well, I'm now a blithering idiot.
wow, I didn't say
So
it.
there's this
Go ahead.
there's this idea that you shouldn't allow parents who are just like uninitiated lay people who don't have the special education in order to raise children. How can we allow them to do something as important as raising the next generation of workers? And so you have the transformation of parenthood into like a second job, right? It's subject to all these key performance indicators. If you mess anything up, you've screwed up your child. You've messed up their life chances. This is the kind of message that you get as a parent. Um, and because parenting becomes associated with this kind of network of social problems. Well, that is a key part of neoliberal governance. is this control of everyday life that comes down to especially the family, because it's like this private sphere that is so important. How can you allow private individuals to do something so important? So if you look at policy documents, they don't there's this turn away from using it, particularly at the EU level. You watch any EU debates, they're like, oh, we prefer not to use the language of parent. We prefer formal carers or informal carers, right? So a parent is an informal carer. Who wants an informal carer? Like it's like the informal economy is the black market, right? So this idea of like, well, this actually should best be done as a job. This should actually best be professionalized and paid for. I mean, that is part of the trajectory of capitalism as it begins to like explain its problems through individual behavior and then becomes more and more obsessed with behavior. But because it has a superficial socialist ring, people go, "Oh yeah, yeah, that sounds great." So what we have this like perverse tendency for socialists to see these sorts of things and they go, "Yay, that's socialism. We did nothing and yet somehow we're winning. Hooray." And then you have the right that's like, "Oh no, that's socialism. They did nothing and somehow they're winning." But what everybody is missing is that it has nothing to do with socialism. It has everything to do with the disintegration of capitalism and its desperate attempt to hold on to itself.
Did you see I had an exchange with Sophie Lewis, I think is her name, on Twitter?
I did see that. Yeah, just briefly. And you
She
wrote
was
that this is not a socialist.
That's right. Yeah. She's for abolishing the family, but she was writing a series of tweets criticizing Christopher Lasch as being
Mm.
revanchist and pro family and supposedly racist. I don't think there's any indication of that in his work at all. But anyway, yeah. So I found her to be incredibly you know what? I would have said irritating, but I didn't even find her irritating. She was just a prototypical kind of example of the confusion around the idea of communism and uh, the kind of one-sided approach to socialism or communism that mistakes the progressive capitalist state for socialism, and also gives itself the permission to claim to be opposed to the bureaucratic deep state, but while every utterance that it lets forth, it basically being in line with the propaganda of the bureaucratic deep state. So
Yeah, when I was reading Sophie Lewis's, well, she's got a few books, but her Abolish the Family book, I was really struck by how much the statements that she talks about the problems with the family remind me of the third way talking about the problems of the family. Now they're like they'll be kind about it, but they will talk about how, oh, we should have empathy for all these things that happen in families, and they'll take like the small numbers of people that unfortunately have really bad experiences, and they will extrapolate that to being a problem with all families instead of like the strong association between poverty and those kinds of problems becomes like the problem with the family more generally and justifies intervention in all families and the increased encroachment of professionalization into parenting. And what's happening now too is like early childhood education is getting earlier and earlier, and the reason is because they want institutions to intervene as early as possible and disrupt supposedly backward forms of socialization. But the bottom line is, if you don't trust workers to raise their families, you do not trust them to run society. That's
oh
just it.
well. Wait, I mean that's taken for granted. Workers can't run society. Hey, let's take a look at the final clip here between Zizek and Piers Morgan. All right, again, I did it again. I was muted. Jeez. All right, so sorry. Um, I am going to run the final clip on the Patreon stream, the Parrot Room stream. And hopefully you'll all be joining me there to remind me when I'm muted and when my microphone is unplugged. So we will run that final clip on the Patreon. People who are watching now who get to the link to join us or join me on StreamYard can do so. I wanted to point out that, this is really, I'm making excuse for my incompetence today as well. On April 16th, we will be running a live stream on this channel. That's a Tuesday. That's the day that we usually do the live streams, but it will be a 15-hour live stream. It will start a few hours earlier. It is marking the 15th anniversary of the Diet Soap podcast. That's the podcast I started that then brought me to Zero Books and now to Sublation. There'll be clips from every year in each hour. I may be traveling around New York City and doing the stream from various locations. I've invited Dennis Perrin to join the stream, an old friend of mine named KMO, who was the first podcaster I started collaborating with, will be there. And there will be others as well. There'll be clips from Wish Pistone, TJ Clark, Margaret Kimberly, a variety, just a huge number of interesting leftists from the 15 years of podcasting. You'll be able to hear it. Look for it. It's click the notify me button, because this is my day to celebrate myself, and I want everyone to come to my birthday party, basically. So see you on the other side. See you in the parrot room. There is a link in the description. I'll pin it as a comment. And thanks for watching me fuck this up today.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential